because we were so focused on pharmacology, on the silver bullet model, the magic bullet model, we made a number of assumptions that had no scientific basis whatsoever. One of them is that very idea that there is always one best solution. As I mentioned, that came from early industrial engineering. They did time and motion studies, and they were convinced that there was one best way to do everything, and that an expert could find it. The problem is that doesn't take into account human beings. Here in the States, as I mentioned, we had this melting pot going on. A man by the name of Samuel Rafinette said early on that their approach was what he called eclectic medicine. And the idea of that was that you look at all of the various things that are working around the world, and you pick and choose the things that are working the best. Then you try combining those in new and different ways to match each individual patient. Eclectic medicine, as I mentioned, was the number one school of herbal medicine until about 1930, when it was shut down. These are the guys that shut it down. Your left, Andrew Carnegie was the steel king. He had built an empire in steel and supplying steel to build railroads. And in 1901, he sold his company to J.P. Morgan for $498 million, if I remember right. Biggest sale of all time, and that was used to create the first billion-dollar company of all time. Andrew Carnegie had been a union breaker. He had actually fired on striking unionists, and he had a really bad reputation as a businessman. And so after he sold his company and retired, he decided to become a philanthropist and try and save his reputation. One of the things he did was started funding education projects. So you will see Carnegie libraries, Carnegie schools across the country. The man on the right is J.D. Rockefeller, another interesting character. He had been the second richest man in the world until Carnegie retired. Then he went on to become the richest man in the world. They were friends and rivals. And they were both built from the same monopolist plot. They both believed that the best way to run the country was to have one single businessman running everything. They turned to the guy in the middle, who was the brother of Simon Flexner at Rockefeller Institute. Abraham Flexner was a teacher who had been teaching in a private school up in upstate New York and had just retired. He had put his younger brother, Simon the MD, through medical school at Johns Hopkins, and they decided that Johns Hopkins was the model that everybody needed to follow as far as medicine was concerned. They wanted to standardize the whole world around one brand of medicine. And they did that. The Flexner Report was backed by the Carnegie Foundation, published by Abraham Flexner, and it recommended that of 155 medical schools at the time, 6 were up to the standards of Johns Hopkins. Another 20 or so could be saved if enough money was thrown at them, and the rest of them all had to go away. And by 1933, that's exactly what happened. They also implemented state licensing boards across the country to make sure that all of the new doctors toed the line. And they implemented medical regulation, which is nothing more than just enforced standards. There's a problem with that, though. In 1952, the Air Force had the best pilots and the best planes in the world. And yet they were finding they were crashing and burning with astonishing frequency. They tried to blame the training, they tried to blame the planes. None of that worked out. They engaged a young lieutenant to look at whether it was possible, since the cockpits had been designed in the 1920s, that maybe the average man had changed since then. The cockpits had all been designed around the average man. So this young lieutenant went out and measured 4,000 pilots on 10 different criteria. One of the things he discovered was that nobody is average. Absolutely nobody is average. In fact, nobody was within 30% of average on all 10 scales out of 4,000 people. As my mother used to say, we're all normal until you get to know us. When they started adjusting the cockpits to the individuals, they solved their problem. We've known about statistics for an awfully long time, but we seem to be pretty slow in the uptake. If you've ever been graded on a bell curve, this is the bell curve we're talking about. On almost every measure you can imagine, from human heartbeats to hummingbird wings, everything falls in a range. And that range is described by a probability distribution called that looks like a bell curve. You can see here that the green curve has a different average than the other three. The other three all share the same average. It's exactly the same average, but the differences are more extreme as you go down vertically. Does that make sense? In medicine, we often ask ourselves the question, how much is enough? And that too is described by the same bell curve. These are actually the same bell curves as the ones you just looked at, but they go from 0 to 100, and they ask the question, how much is enough? Now, in both cases, the really important point is right there in the center, because that's where we have all the data. But imagine for a moment that the green curve is the effect curve, the one you know the most about. If you only have one medicine, the only thing you can do in order to get more people under treatment is to push up that curve. And the farther you go up that curve, you're increasing the dose and running into the other curves. And what are the other curves? Could be toxic effect curves, could be the lethal dose curve. And one of the problems that we have with both of those is that it is ethically impossible for us to test for them in humans. We don't know where they are, and we don't know what the slopes are. Now, I pulled these graphs from Wikipedia. They weren't trying to make that point, but it's pretty darn obvious, isn't it? If we don't know the shape of those curves, and we're pushing up that green curve as far as we can go to try and get more people treated by our magic bullet medicine, we're going to run into trouble. And in fact, we are. Medical error is now number 3 color in the United States, behind only heart disease and cancer. Number 4 is unexpected side effects of medicines with no error in either the prescription or the administration. That's about 100,000 people a year here. One of the things that we know from statistics, if you know what the mean is, you can calculate a thing called the standard deviation, which calculates the width of the various bell curves. And once you know the standard deviation, you know that 2/3 of the population, roughly, falls within one standard deviation. These are things that are mostly normal. That's actually more than twice as wide as the 30% that they were looking for in the Air Force. But 2/3 of us are relatively normal. Another 13.6% on each side fall between 1 and 2 standard deviations of the mean, and 2.1% of us fall outside of that. Now, when you take both of those into account, you're looking at almost 5% are out on those extreme ends of the scale, and they go on for a long way. I stand 6'5". That puts me in the 1 percentile of weirdness for height. I'm nothing compared to Shaquille O'Neal. I'm not even 3 standard deviations from the mean. He's 5. But if you look at these statistics, one of the things you will conclude is that because these are all independent variables, every additional one we look at, we're going to fall somewhere else on it. And your chances of being in that long tail on some of them are really high. There are about 200 million genetic variables alone in the human body. Add to that epigenetic variables, microbiome variables, history, goals, environment, all the various things that may happen to us. The number of variables is ridiculous. Now, the whole reason we picked the magic bullet was we were trying to simplify the science so that we could say we control all of the variables. Yeah, we haven't. All of those variables are still there, and we now know that the randomization that we were counting on to wash out all of that variability doesn't work until you get about 1,000 subjects. So, what does this mean? It means that in your case, about 5% of the variables in your body are in those extreme ends. Now ask yourself this: if you're going to the doctor about something that's bothering you, are you going there for something that's in the middle? No. You're going for those extreme ends. And what are they treating you with? A tool that's designed for the middle. So how do we fix it? A couple of simple things. Number one, we need to recognize that we are all different. Secondly, we need to recognize that people who are different need different options. Right now, we have a system in which the government approves all of the options. They have never approved more than about 50 in a single year. Look at the dietary supplement industry, which since 1994, when the SHA was passed, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. Since then, we have created about 3,000 new supplements a year. That's what happens when you get the government out of the way of having to approve everything. Finally, as we saw from the dose response curve, the green curve that we were looking at, safe and effective is a myth. It's not safe and effective. It's safe or effective based on the dose, as long as you're in that monotherapy model. Until you get out of the monotherapy model and start using things synergistically, then you can push down the curve instead of up. You can use smaller doses, and when you use smaller doses, two things happen. Number one, because you're combining medicines, if something doesn't work for you, something else likely will. Secondly, if you have an adverse reaction to something, it's likely to be less severe because you're using a smaller dose. So, done well, complex formulas, as are used in TCM and in Ayurvedic medicine, are actually both more safe and more effective than the monotherapy model. And finally, you need to ask yourself this question. Who knows better what's best for you than you? If somebody is deciding what's safe and effective for everybody, they are obviously eliminating a lot of options that otherwise would be available to you. And if you're one of those poor people who are dependent on those options, then you need to go begging to your government for permission to save your own life. And that, I submit, is absolutely idiotic. So, welcome. You're in the right place. We're talking about the right stuff. And it's absolutely critical that every last one of us. I used to think, maybe I'm lucky, but I didn't see the serious problems that some people do with Wi-Fi or with different medicines or whatever the case may be. Maybe I was lucky, but maybe I just don't even know that there are solutions out there for some of the things that I deal with every day. And maybe you're in that same boat. So, thank you. How are we doing that? I'm going to pass around the mic. Oh, okay. Yes.
Thanks, Matt. I had a couple questions in mind. I'll just ask one. So you said the FDA can't give you the individualized solution. They can only give you that middle bell curve area that's going to be either safe or effective. Can the FDA even be trusted at all to give us a better health system? What's the solution for the FDA?
In my view, to be perfectly honest, the only solution to the FDA is to take it apart. The reason I would submit was that the guy who originally created the FDA, what was his name, ran the poison groups back in the early 1900s. Anyway, he had been the head chemist with USDA and created what was eventually to become the FDA. By about 1918, even before it was the FDA, he was so disgusted with the industry capture that had been going on then that he quit and went on to create a consumer group to look at those same kinds of issues, where he would not be crowned by industry pressure. So that's the short answer. I don't think there's any hope for it. One of the things the founding fathers did was they said, the bigger the barrel, the bigger the pork barrel, the more noses that are going to be shoved in it. And so they intended to reduce the scope of the federal government to only those things that were absolutely necessary. International trade between the states, a few other things. Since then, and especially since about the 1930s, we have got the federal government in almost everything. And we see the predictable results that the founding fathers predicted. Other questions? Yes?
Well, there's some who say that things more clearly standardization, just an word used for centralization, and centralization is vehicle for power control only. In your opinion, do you think that these people who are promoting standardization under the guise of improving safety, efficacy, they know what's effective. I mean, they're really not interested in safety or efficacy or benefit of anybody, but they're all just interested in control and power and trying to be not control.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. And you look around Adam Smith was probably the best on this subject, but Adam Smith talked about a free market in which, because everybody else has other choices and options, they will automatically come to an agreement between themselves, between buyer and seller, that benefits both parties. It's the earliest concept of win-win we know, right? But a monopoly is not that. And in fact, his book, Wealth of Nations, is almost entirely a diatribe against the British East India Company, which had been formed in 1600 and existed until 1874, in which they were exploiting the colonies and the British people and their overseas customers, all because they could. Because the government not only let them, it gave them the monopoly right to do so. Well, today we're doing the same darn thing. It seems like we haven't learned anything in 250 years. I think that's probably all we've got time for.
Hello, for those of you who weren't here last night, I'm Jamie Bells. I'm with the Nutritional Therapy Association. I shared in our welcome session last evening that the NTA has been around since 1997, providing solutions for people to really be healthy. Things like eating nutrient-dense foods that aren't poison, digesting those foods properly, honoring the bio-individual like Matt just talked about, because we are all unique. We're each individual in so many different ways, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And making sure that our hydration status is on par and reducing the total stress burden for each of us. We teach these things and have been doing that since 1997. And I recently learned within the last year, I learned about NHF just before this conference last year, and the NGA has made a renewed commitment to help spread the word and just make sure that we rise NHF in the future, because it's so important what we're doing, all those things that Matt just talked about, helping others to learn this. You're here because you know, you get it, but I want this room to be packed. I want so many people to care so much more, but it takes all of us to help teach them, and so I'm so thankful. I'm thankful that you are here. I'm thankful for all of our speakers. I get the honor and privilege of introducing our next speaker today. And I have to tell you, I grew up on a farm in northern Minnesota. I was in FFA, Future Farmers of America. I was also in 4-H, and that was my upbringing. I grew up on a century farm that my father's great-grandfathers, my great-great-grandfather homesteaded. And so my brother-in-law, he's big into farming, and after I came to the conference last year and went home and I was sharing about how incredible everyone I met, man, I met all these people, and these are my people, everybody's doing the good things. And I shared with him that I had met Howard Leader. And my very, very married to a woman for 20 years, brother-in-law, he's a farmer guy, he went, "Oh, you had Howard?" So I texted him as soon as I found out that I got to introduce Howard, and he geeked out a little bit. Howard is a well-known American agriculture speaker, farmer, and advocate for regenerative, non-GMO, and transparent food systems. He's especially recognized in circles that challenge conventional industrial agricultural practices, and has a lot of fans, big fans in northern Minnesota. Howard, please welcome Howard Leader to the stage. And my husband, myself, who is going to help grab.
the opportunity to speak here again. It's humbling to be amongst a group of such amazing individuals. I was blown away with the conference last year. It was just really, really special. I identify myself as a student of the soil. In 1989, we switched to alternative farming methods on our farm in northwest Iowa. Today it's known as regenerative agriculture. I am in attendance of Hard Knocks University. My applied focus to problem solving is using common sense and critical thinking whenever possible. And I am extremely blessed to be gifted by the good Lord to see what you look at. Looking back, I say I became a crop and livestock nutrition advisor in 1992. In 1994, I started studying GMO crops. In 1997, I started doing on-farm research. I am the primary coordinator and co-author of a scientific study that was published in 2013. It was the first of its kind lifetime feeding study ever conducted in the world, and I will share the results of that with you today. I'm going to throw a lot at you in a little time. I'm guilty of mashing as much material into a small space as I possibly can. So bear with me. Commodity production and nutrient-dense food production. Commodity production, the number one objective of commodity production agriculture is to be the least cost producer. To grow as much bulk as possible at the lowest possible price. Nutrient-dense food production, which is what we focus on our regenerative farm in northwest Iowa, we want to have as much nutrient density and cleanliness in every single thing that we produce. What's the problem, in my opinion? Especially why are the children so unhealthy in our country? Number one, the lack of nutrient density. Because the nutrient density is devoid in most of the commodity production, what ends up in the food supply is not satisfying the needs of those that consume it. Number two, it's foreign proteins from GMO crops. I'm going to expand on this a little bit later. I've been blessed to be mentored by one of the best in the world, Dr. Arpai Pustai, who is in heaven today. Chemical contaminants, whether it's glyphosate, chlorinated water, you name it, that's next on the list in my opinion. The injected toxins, we're going to have some of the best people in the industry speaking at this conference about that. The Wi-Fi, the electromagnetic frequencies, and finally the lack of physical activity. What's the number one ag item that's ordered each year from the U.S.? Topsoil. 4.7 metric tons per hectare, or 2.09 ton per acre. 1 pound of topsoil is lost in the U.S. for every bushel of corn produced each year. There's a source of that information. This is a picture of a CAFO cattle feeding facility. CAFO is Confined Animal Feeding Operation. Northwest Iowa is where I live. Sioux County, Iowa is the home of chemical-intensive industrial agriculture. This is a piece of land that has had CAFO manure applied to it from a dairy operation. Again, CAFO, Confined Animal Feeding Operation. It was applied with a drag line setup like this. You know how they tell if you have enough CAFO manure on a field? They start in the bottom corner and they go to the top and they go kittybumps, and when they get to the top, they stop the tractor, they step out on the platform, they jump on the ground, and if the manure oozes out of the other corner of the field, they quit. If it doesn't, they'll go over it again. This is the way we raise beef on our farm. Commodity production agriculture uses predominantly genetically engineered crops. This is going to be a rehash for some of you, but I don't know that we can hear it enough. And you're going to get a really good perspective from my dear friend Dr. Carroll tomorrow on this. Genetic engineering and gain of function. In my opinion, is there any difference? Genetic engineering, they're tinkering with the DNA of the plant. Gain of function, they're tinkering with the DNA. Is there really any difference? Is it time that we properly identify this? How would the people react if they knew that 85% of the processed foods in the grocery store contain foreign proteins from crops that were developed using gain of function technology? And it's everywhere. It's unlabeled. We're not finding out about it. So what's the motivation? In the early 90s, I had a full-service crop, livestock, custom application, seed fertilizer chemical business. I saw this beast develop from ground level. The technology fees are the royalties that are paid on the genetically engineered seed. And in 2000, the genetic engineered seeds came on the market in 1996. In 2010 was the year when I added up the numbers. I took the USDA planted acres for corn, soy, cotton, canola, and sugar beets. And at that time we could still separate the cost of the seed and the tech fee. So I did the math, presuming 100% implementation. $60 per acre was the tech fee on corn. That generated a little over $5.25 billion, presuming all the acres planted. Soybeans, it was $24 an acre at 78.9, according to USDA's planning, just under $1.9 billion. Cotton was 10.9 at 78, so that chipped in $850 million and change. Sugar beets was a lesser crop, but a higher tech fee. It kicked in $96 million. Canola, we don't raise much of that, so that was only $9 million in the U.S. So the subtotal was just under $8.7 billion in the U.S. I've been blessed to speak in Canada several times, so I also included their numbers for that year. And it totaled up to $9.9 billion tech fee. Not seed, not fertilizer, not chemical, nothing but tech fee. What could be their possible motivation? The herbicide-tolerant crops, the Roundup Ready, the glyphosate resistant, they were definitely the on-ramp to put this thing into full force to the farmers adapted to it. In 96, it was 32 ounces an acre. By 2010, it was up to 96 ounces an acre, and some farmers were putting on 2 and 3 applications a year because they had weeds that wouldn't die when they were sprayed. Argentina started at 2 liters per hectare. By 2010, they were up to 20 liters per hectare. This is a map of the glyphosate use in our country. I'm going to go back and forth here. This is a map of the cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in our country. Is there a correlation between the use of that product and cancer? This is my crude way of helping people understand genetic engineering. Imagine this is the DNA of the plant and you're going to inject something into that and you have absolutely zero control over where it's going to land. I used to say they had 1 in 100,000 chance, and a molecular biologist from Washington State University politely corrected me in Washington State when I was there for the I-522 effort, and she said it's 1 in a sextillion to 1 in 100 sextillion that you can put it in the same spot twice, and you're going to find out why that's important shortly. The second generation GMO products using CRISPR, they said, well, it's much more accurate. We step and insert, and we can do it exactly like we want to. But the fact that they fail to recognize is the interspatial relationship. They have zero control on what happens, on what effects are removed. How did that affect this component, that component? Let there be no mistake. The good Lord's the only one that knows how to put this together. And as long as they refuse to recognize the shortcomings of the technology, they can never perfect the technology. Dr. Huber says the biggest inhibiting factors to successful genetic engineering is genetic engineering. If you want to see how this was illegally approved in our country, Read Stephen Berker's book. He's an attorney. He sued the FDA. He won the lawsuit, but no administration has been willing to uphold the law. Dr. Arpad Pusztai, I can't tell you how blessed I was to be mentored by this man. He did the first in the world scientific study on a GMO crop. It was a BT potato. I won't go into depth about that study, but he believed that technology was going to be positive. And he helped me understand it's not what they're inserting. In the early days, well, we said it was the BT, or it was this, or it was that, or it was the other thing. He said, Howard, these potatoes are identical. I take a gene out of this one and put it in this one. It's already in here. He said, it's the process of the insertion that puts in place a high likelihood of the development of foreign protein in the fruit of that plant. Greater than 95%. So what happens with that foreign protein? 70 to 80% of our cells of our immune system are in our digestive tract. When you consume something that has that foreign protein in it, your immune system goes on alert. Imagine, if you will, this wall is the foreign protein that has just entered the digestive tract. The man is your immune system, trying to get rid of this foreign invader, working 24/7, 365. What happens when your immune system is working 24 hours a day to try to get rid of this foreign protein? Does the strength go down? Are we seeing an increase in autoimmune illnesses in our country and around the world? This is a picture of a healthy pig stomach. I was blessed to work with crop producers all across the Midwest and the early adapters of the genetically engineered grains separated. We saw digestive and reproductive issues where the genetically engineered crops were utilized. That led us to doing necropsy work on a regular basis. This is a pig that was fed drug-free for its life and non-GMO. You can see the skin tone color. It's a healthy stomach. This is from a pig that was fed a drug-free diet but GMO feed. You can see the irritation and inflammation. This is another drug-free fed pig, and you see more inflammation and also some ulcers that are healed. This is a pig that was on an antibiotic regimen in most of its lifetime, and as you can see, the antibiotics reduced the inflammation, but it didn't stop the ulcers. The first time I showed these slides to a group of farmers in South Dakota, one guy in the back room says, "There's no way that pig should be alive." I said, "Don't worry, it's not." This led us to do a scientific study. I was privileged to be connected with Dr. Judy Carmen from Australia. She's in the background in this picture. We took 168 pigs and divided them evenly into two groups by sex and by weight. We drew numbers out of the hat. We fed them non-GMO corn and soy and GMO corn and soy for their lifetime as a meat animal, and then did complete necropsies on them when they were harvested. Again, this is a healthy pig stomach. This is from the non-GMO diet. This is from the GMO diet. The statistical findings of the study. There was a 260% increased likelihood of severe inflammation in the stomachs of the pigs that ate the GMO diet. For the males, it was a 400% increase. For the females, it was a 220% increase. The weight of the utera of the GM-fed female was 25% abnormally heavy compared to the non-GMO fed. We did not have the money to do the histological analysis on either the stomachs or the utera, but Dr. Carmen was literally jumping up and down when she come up with the statistical findings of this study. She said, "The bloody bastard was right, the bloody bastard was right." Because we found a problem with the digestive and the reproductive. What we didn't figure on, Dr. Pusztai told me, I sent him the protocol before we did the study, and he said, "You have to weigh these pigs every week." I said, "We'll weigh them in the nursery, we'll weigh them out of the nursery, and we'll weigh them when we're done." He said, "No, you will weigh them every week." I said, "That's a lot of cotton-picking work." He said, "I don't care." So we did it. When they were little, we picked them up, we put them on the scale, we wrote down a number, we wrote down their weight, we put them back. When they got big, we couldn't do that. So we had a simple maze that was set up. The pigs were always in pen A, B, C, and D. The people that weighed the pigs didn't know who was fed what. It was a double-blind study, and they weighed them every week. They'd open the gate, run them down, pen A go through, pen B go through. They went through the simple maze, easy kind of playtime. Hey, it's fun to get out and kick up our heels. Pen C and Pen D couldn't navigate this simple maze on a weekly basis. Pigs are creatures of habit. As soon as they got in confined quarters, they start fighting, biting, and picking on one another. Which ones do you think were eating the GMOs? Dr. Carmen went on to do a study on this with rats, on GM corn and GM soy. I can't tell you the results of the study because they haven't been published yet. But I will ask you this question. In 1996, before 85% of the processed foods in the grocery store contained foreign proteins from GMOs, how many people did you know that were on mood-altering medications for ADD, ADHD, and the like? Compared to what it is today, when not only do 85% of the processed foods contain foreign proteins from GMOs, they also contain glyphosate and other chemical residues. What's the rate of medication being used, especially on our young? The animals know the difference. Dr. Huber was sent these pictures. A gentleman put two bags in the warehouse side by side with GMO and non-GMO ears of corn, and the mice chose which one to eat. I showed this picture to a group of farmers from Ohio, and he did his own experiment. He put one of his non-GMO ears of corn on a nail in the tree and borrowed one from the neighbor and took this picture 9 months later. Glyphosate. The elephant in the room. I've been blessed to work with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. since the latter part of 2013. I challenged him in the fall of 2019 about a speech that he gave, because he made some inaccurate statements, which many people have done. And I learned to, keep your mouth shut, because as a result, when I gave him the outline and the history of glyphosate, he says, "Would you put that all down for me?" So it's in essence a white paper. You can still find it on the website today. Dr. Huber, Dr. Dunham, Dr. Kramer, Dr. Farrell, all three peer-reviewed it before I submitted it. And it's my attempt to give a elementary explanation of this very complex compound. The first patent that was filed in glyphosate was as a broad-spectrum chelator. Chelate's a Greek word meaning claw or to hold. Glyphosate chelates calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, copper, nickel, cobalt, boron, selenium, molybdenum, and potassium, and it does not let go. It takes a minuscule amount of glyphosate residue to chelate those minerals wherever they're present, whether it's in the soil or in the grain. The first thing it was used for was a pipe cleaner. They would run the glyphosate through the pipes. We had hot water heat that reduced the scale, and voila, pipes are clean. Well, it's also known to be a growth regulator, a pathogen virulence enhancer, a herbicide, toxica, an organic phosphate. The synthetic amino acid, folks, that's the part that's the most researched in science, and it's the scariest part. I hope the study that I know of in that sector gets published soon. But Monsanto, who filed the herbicide, or got the patent for it as a herbicide in 1969 for Roundup, also filed a patent in 2003 and were granted it as an antimicrobial agent. You can do this search by yourself, go to the patent office and type in the number, patent number 7771736, and read about the effects that it has on the microbial community. Glyphosate does not kill weeds. Now that's got to be the dumbest statement you ever heard anybody ever say, because it's the most widely used herbicide in the world. I'm going to give you the real quick on this. Pot A and Pot B and Pot C were filled with soil from the field. Pot A was put in an autoclave and it was nuked. 60 degrees Celsius for 1 hour. There's no life in that soil. They planted a bean like you would plant your garden in each pot. When they got to the size of the bean in Pot A, they sprayed Pot A and B with Roundup. As you see, the bean in Pot B died. The one in Pot A stopped growing. They took this picture 2 weeks later, And it stopped growing because glyphosate technically affects the EPSPS enzyme at the start of the shipment pathway. My elementary attempt of explaining that is the EPSPS enzyme is the toll booth for the toll road. If you don't pay the toll, you don't go. Well, if you don't have the opening of the shipment pathway with the EPSPS enzyme, you don't get the growth hormones to flow, and you don't get the protective part of the plant, the enzymes and amino acids to flow. So when the plant stops growing in pot A, the enzymes or the growth hormones stop flowing. But because there's no pathogens in the soil to cause the disease that actually killed the edible bean in pot B, you shut down that plant's defense mechanisms. They have a defense mechanism, we have an immune system. The picture on the right is where they injected anthracnose into corn plants, and plant A protected itself. It walled it off. But the ones in the picture on B and C, they were sprayed with Roundup. It shut down the defense mechanism. Dr. Huber, Dr. McNeil said it's like giving the plant a bad case of AIDS. Glyphosate continually and persistently diminishes the beneficial organism population and drives the virulence of the opportunistics wherever it's present. This is a picture of a combine harvesting non-GMO soybeans. I want you to look closely at the dust and the color of the dust. This is side-by-side pictures of combines harvesting Liberty Link soybeans, which has glufosinate as the active ingredient, and Roundup Ready soybeans, which has glyphosate as the active ingredient. A gentleman who was quite astute in Northwest Iowa recognized this in his farming operation with his dad and his brother. And this is the proper use of an N95 dust mask, by the way. It won't stop the virus, like we all know, but it's handy in. He sent these dust samples into the lab, and I apologize for how small they are, but I'll show you on the next slide. The Roundup Ready corn dust at 15,600,000 CFUs per gram, all Aspergillus species. Aspergillus are known as one of the most opportunistic fungi species that we have. The Liberty Link corn dust had 7,200,000. Of that 7 million was the Aspergillus, and 200,000 was the penicillium. I bring this up for this reason. Why, at harvest time in the Midwest, do we see an outbreak of respiratory illness? We've got glyphosate killing and glufosinate killing the good organisms in the soil and promoting the disease-causing organisms, and then the mold and the mycotoxin spores are airborne. Well, who walks around and breathes the air? Could there be a correlation between these respiratory ailments and this harvest time? What about motels in town? Why is there mold? Whoops. Why is there mold? They're using Roundup to spray the weeds all around the motel, so it looks pretty. Do you think it doesn't hurt the beneficial organisms in the ground around the motel? And guess what? We get a production of those mold and mycotoxin causing spores from the soil. They go right into the ventilation system. Should we change what we're doing? This is an example of the residual effects of glyphosate. You can all look this study up, and I encourage you to do it. Do an internet search, The Saga of the Soggy Sauerkraut. You're going to see where they threw away $1 million of sauerkraut because of glyphosate. They used poultry litter from a CAFO operation to fertilize the land where they grew the cabbage for the organic sauerkraut, which the blessings of USDA is on this. In every ton of poultry litter, in every 3 ton of poultry litter, based on the cumulative results we've looked at, you're going to have 2/3 of a quart of Roundup between the glyphosate and the AMPA residue in that manure. Dr. Huber and Dr. McNeil were involved in this. The world's largest sauerkraut company was struggling to figure out why did they have to throw away $1 million worth of sauerkraut. They did they figured it all out. And the good news is, as you'll read in the study, we now have a natural cocktail of microorganisms that has the ability to remediate the glyphosate PA residues in the soil. It was the best news I've ever seen or heard since I've been on this trail. We owe Dr. Monica Kruger a huge debt of gratitude for the work that she did at Leipzig University, showing us the damaging effects of minuscule amounts of glyphosate. A tenth of a part per million knocked out the Lactobacillus, Enterococcus faecalis, and the bifidobacteria, causing chronic botulism. Dr. Nancy Swanson, in 2010, published a study where 12 different ailments in our country. And I picked this one on diabetes, and I encourage you to look this study up also. But that green line is a trend line. You go back to 1990, and it goes to 2010. Well, lo and behold, 1996, when Roundup Ready crops came into being, look what happened. The Pearson correlation factor on these ailments and the implementation and the use of the genetically engineered crops is over 94% on every single one of them, and some over 98%. It doesn't prove causation. Do you think we ought to maybe at least take a look? The ubiquitous presence of glyphosate residue, it's almost everywhere. You're going to get the privilege tomorrow of listening to my dear friend Dr. Michelle Perro, who's a hero in the pediatric arena. She's been telling the truth about the damaging effects of GMOs and glyphosate longer than anybody I know. Her new book is just available on Amazon. Get a copy. Before it came out, I would show what's making our children sick. And I'd say, here's the problem, folks. What's making our children sick? And then I would say, here's the solution, folks. This is an interactive slide. You need to participate with me in this, please. Do you recognize any of the names in the center of the circle? Have you ever seen an advertisement or a commercial on TV that says if you can't afford your medication cost, contact us. We have a program to assist you. Brought to you by AstraZeneca. Have you ever heard of a product called atrazine? One of the oldest herbicides used in corn production, made by AstraZeneca Syngenta. AstraZeneca Syngenta, which was bought out by ChemChina about 5 years ago, is the number 4 producer of genetically engineered crops in the world. When you see or hear Bayer, what's the first thing you think of? Aspirin. Okay, how about Bayer Cropscience, makers of Aztec insecticide, Liberty herbicide, and genetically engineered crops. And they'll likely go down in history as being making the dumbest investment ever when they paid $63 billion for a company known by the name of Monsanto. But before they bought Monsanto, did you know that Pfizer Pharmacy of John was the parent company of Monsanto for a period of time? So we've established the fact that all the companies in the center of the circle are in the pharmaceutical and chemical business. We're going to start with chemical. I want you to give me one word that you would use to describe a chemical to a 5-year-old child. And this chemical is something that kills a weed or an insect. What one word might you use? Poison. Okay, we're using poison to raise crops. What do we raise crops for? Cereal and grain. What do we feed the bulk of the grain to? So, if this poison has a residual effect, do you think it'd be positive or negative? So if there's an adverse effect of using this poison on the crop, and you feed the grain to the livestock, and the livestock don't feel good, who do you call for help? When a veterinary comes and looks at your livestock, what might he recommend you give them to make them feel better? What if you want your livestock to grow faster? What might you give them? What do we raise livestock for? Who eats the meat? So if there's an adverse effect of using this poison to feed that affects the grain, that affects the livestock, is there a small chance it could affect the meat and the people that eat it? If the people don't feel good, where do they go for help? After you go to the doctor, where might he send you with a piece of paper with their autograph on it? Does that present any positive cash flow for the companies from the center of the circle? I did this illustration with a minimal change in the companies the first time in 2003 in the VFW hall in here in South Dakota for a group of farmers. At that time, I did not want to believe that there was anything intentional about what was going on. Today, I can't believe otherwise. If you want more information about a possible alternative to glyphosate, feel free to stop and talk to myself today or my associate tomorrow. This is a project that's been worked on since June 2015 and is finally coming to fruition. It is an EPA registered bioherbicide product. The definition of a bioherbicide from EPA's perspective is something that is naturally occurring. The company has put together a synthesized version of non-anoic acid, which is a naturally occurring acid in many different types of plants, that combine it with the right natural oil wetting agent emulsifier package to get penetration of the acid into the plant. I can't tell you that it causes desiccation by dehydration, as Dr. Rick Haney described when I introduced him to it many years ago. He said death by drought, because EPA in their infinite wisdom, or whatever else you want to call it, has no mode of action for a class of group 27 herbicide. So common sense is strictly forbidden, but it has no adverse effects like glyphosate. Thank you.
I have a question for you. I want to start by saying a series of information, right? I love your presentation, and I love that it is a food-based presentation, because that is a niche in this conversation about poison. Okay, but I'm going to argue with a couple points, and I'm going to ask you for some, maybe you can figure this one out, right? Okay, so a couple things. We know from the Monsanto trial, right, that ended in an $11 billion payout on this lawsuit. Those weren't consumers eating food, okay? Those were people out in the field, landscapers and farmers, okay? So the class action included both of those. It was easier to prove the case for the landscapers than it was for the farmers, for a lot of reasons. But the action by which they were damaged was not consumption through eating. It was by topical application for the most part, arguably also inhalation. And I don't know that we have any distinction between harm from going through your skin and being absorbed through your skin and inhalation. But my question to you is, if you could find this data, how much of your slideshow would change if you could show how much of this chemical was crop dusted versus used land application versus aerial application? How much of that would fine-tune your map? I bet you it would even show more causation than what you have, just as a point of reference, point of information. You follow me?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you've said, and sadly, and her question is how is the comparative to ingestion versus dermal, and that information isn't there.
Right.
You know, I worked with RFK and Michael Baum and Brent Wisner and the team that won these cases, and I provided information and also science, because I'm blessed to be connected to an international scientific listserv, and we would get there for a while. It was nonstop, the new studies on the harms of glyphosate.
Yeah.
And when the accumulation of the independent scientific literature got across a certain point,
right,
to pin the tail on the donkey for glyphosate non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In the Bellwether case, Dwayne Lane Johnson was the first one, but in the Bellwether case, the judge honored Monsanto's request to bifurcate the trial. They said, you have to prove that there's a cause from glyphosate to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma before this can move forward. So the judge agreed to that. We split it in two phases. They presented the evidence from the science first, and of course we had independent science and we had industry propaganda, is what I call it. And when the judge gave the jury that first phase of the trial, he said, well, it's debatable, and this is not directly what he said, but it's my paraphrase, it's debatable the science on whether or not this does cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but he had never in his lifetime witnessed a company having such ill regard of how damaging their products were to those that were exposed to them. And he had been favoring Monsanto every step of the way. Well, the end result of that trial was a $2 billion verdict. And it was the bellwether case that brought forward that first settlement. So I testified at the Senate subcommittee hearing in Iowa 3.5 years ago against the chemical liability protection legislation. And I refuted all the lies that the Bayer lobbyist and the Bayer employee told in their comments. And I had science and I had legal precedent to back up everything I say. And I said, when we crossed the bar for the digestive issues, the reproductive issues, the liver, the kidney, I said, that's why they want this protection. They're not worried about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They're worried about all these other ailments that is avalanche on our country. As the science emerges, they're going to be holding back because they're going to be found guilty.
Would you mind doing a quick highlight on neonicotinoids?
Come closer, please. I have this nagging thing called tinnitus, and it's at full bar with the Wi-Fi in this building, so I can hear good, but I can't hear over it.
Oh, would you mind quickly noting neonicotinoids and neonicotinoids?
Oh. She asked about neonicotinoids. The neonicotinoid is a systemic insecticide that is on literally every genetically engineered seed that goes in the ground, because they have the soil so mucked up with the damaging effects of the synthetic products that the natural properties that would be there to protect against the nematodes and or the other root-feeding predators against the plant, they're wiped out. So they put the neonicotinoid on everything. And when you go buy a plant for your garden, read it closely, because they're using that neonicotinoids on a lot of the garden seeds too. And they're also putting neonicotinoids in flea and tick collars. Next question. The question is, we can't stop using glyphosate or we won't be able to farm. And that, sadly, is a true statement because of the lack of mentality in broad-scale production agriculture. You know, the first counter to that is, well, how did we possibly farm before we had 1970? Oh, we can't go back. Well, the dumbing down has worked, and it's by design. And if you haven't read the book, The President Makers, which I promised Matt I'm going to give him a copy of it, it shows how, and he hit on it with Rockefeller and Carnegie, and there were some other ilk in that crew that combined in that effort. They hijacked our entire education system. So can we do it? Yes, absolutely can. But we can't do it like that. Sri Lanka is a good example of what happens when you try that. They had a train wreck. And, you know, Ray Archuleta is a good friend of mine. Gabe Brown's a good friend of mine. Education is what we need to help the farmers understand how to implement the regenerative farming concepts properly and successfully. That's lack of major. Can it be done? Yes. That I know how damaging it is. I agree, and I'll guarantee you when Bobby had to support his boss, who might have fired him if he didn't support him on that executive order. It was one of the hardest things he ever did in his life, and that came out when he did the interview with Joe Rogan afterwards. Yes. Well, her point is that, you know, people don't understand the whole story of Bear.
Could you repeat the question, please?
I'm doing that. Her point is that people don't understand the full aspects and the history of the company Bear. Well, go back to the technology fees. $9.9 billion a year. What's that give them? Money for advertising. Now, you don't have to tell the truth. If you got enough money, you could just repeat the same lie over and over and over and over and over again. And what do they say? It's harder to convince people of the truth than it is a lie when they've heard the lie too often. So, yes.
Normally, when a product goes to market, somebody the legal team working with that product says, we've got to make sure the product is safe, because somebody's going to get sued if it's not safe. That obviously is not happening with pesticides. So the question is, why did this happen? Why are they afraid of legal liability? Is there somebody that's protecting them? Is it the government who's protecting them? The government wants to cover all this up because they don't want to be implicated, especially with the scandalous negligence of protecting the American people from dangerous toxins spread all through the agricultural system.
His question is, why is the government allowing this? I guess would be a way to summarize it. And of course, the model of the protection of the liability, you're going to hear from much more qualified speakers than I am about how that happened in the pharmaceutical side of things. But I've worked with the EPA directly since 2018, and I've heard some different applications for EPA, FDA, and so on and so forth, CDC, and I don't apply it to RFK's attempts to straighten it out, but EPA, I've heard, does EPA mean ensure pesticide applications? Is CDC the Center for Disease Causation? Is FDA the Forced Drug Administration? And do they work with the World Homicide Organization?
That leads me to this point and your question. I know you had at the center a bunch of different companies, and I know you're qualifying them as chemical companies, but it's been my experience when you take that up one notch, you are dealing with the Department of Defense. These are government contractors with large contracts for chemical agents used elsewhere, for bombs, for all kinds of, like on B. I mean, the history of these companies come from weapons.
Her point is the pharmaceutical and chemical companies are one of the same, and fertilizer companies and a spinoff from Department of Defense, and this can be easily traced back to when chemical warfare was supposedly made illegal. What were they going to use those synthetic products for? They were liking the revenue stream that they had from doing that, so production agriculture came into focus. How am I on time? I'm done. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, testing 1, 2. We're going to go right into the health payment side of health freedom. And one of the dynamics I noticed becoming a lobbyist in health freedom was that there was a division between health freedom and health reform. And when I was a congressional staffer back in the early 90s fighting Hillary Care, we Republican LAs were pretty clueless on health care, at least I was. And we were rescued by some smart people like John Goodman, who had this book called Patient Power. And he taught us something called the health savings account. Fast forward to today, when I'm not getting paid to lobby for the world's oldest health freedom organization, I'm out hustling as a health insurance salesman to sell Obamacare. And if you are active with this account, and roll that mercy of a third party, whether insurance or sharing for the government. Now, health reform has gone along for decades, and John's always been there advising mostly conservatives about insurance reform. He's very big on the Medicare privatization debate as well. But in my opinion, we just had a big event with President Trump proposing to give the subsidies in Obamacare not to the insurance companies, but rather to you, to the people. And that would be an earth-shaking change if that happened. And as a health freedom person, I like to tell my fellow MAHA people that you have to have a health payment discussion for health freedom. Experience insurance when you create cash patients, whether using a or which promotes cash shopping, you help create because patient choice of services, them learn alternative pharma and allopathy. Is critical. The economist and the father of the health savings account and the main source of health reform or John.
All right. Introduction on that. Makes you feel like you should run. I'm John Goodman. I approve that message. Now, a few weeks ago, PBS NewsHour had me on, and they said the Republican answer on health care is health savings accounts. And they introduced me as a father of health savings accounts. And I was appreciative of all of that, but I'm going to say something that may surprise some of you. The greatest obstacle in Washington right now to rational health reform is partisanship. And this goes back many decades, all the way back to Hillary Clinton. What happens is that two parties follow this scenario. They devise a health reform without any input from the other party. Then they put their plan on the floor. Nobody from the other party is going to vote for it. So to push it over the finish line, they have to go to the special interests. And who are they? Well, they're the hospitals and the drug companies and the insurance companies. Those are the groups that spend the most money lobbying on health care in Washington. And of course, to get their support, we have to make a few changes in the bill. What we end up with are bad public policy that channels billions of dollars to those special interests and does almost nothing to improve the health of people. And we did that with George W. Bush, with Medicare Part D, which is a very poorly designed program. And we did it on the Democratic side with Obamacare. And we had other efforts that weren't successful. Hillary Clinton, maybe before some of you were born, tried with a health reform, had no Republican input. And then Paul Ryan on the Republican side came up with a plan with no Democratic input. And here's something that may surprise you. This is not how we got health savings accounts. We got health savings accounts back in the early 90s because it was bipartisan. So both in the House and the Senate, we had Democrats and Republicans backing the idea. No special interest was behind the idea. So we were opposed by the doctors, we were opposed by the hospitals, the insurance companies, the business roundtable. Everybody was against us, all the special interests. But we got a pilot program in 1996, and then in 2000, we got savings accounts for the whole. Because it was bipartisan, and all the opposition. Here was a health care for Congress. And the first half of the year, everything was about Medicaid and what are we going to do with it. And the second half of the year was about second-tier subsidies in Obamacare and what are we going to do about that. And it followed a familiar pattern. Republicans want to spend less, Democrats want to spend more. Neither party wants to do anything to reform these programs. Now, just by show of hands, how many of you think that Medicaid is a really good insurance plan? I don't think I saw a single hand. So let me ask you this. How many of you think that we could reform Medicaid and make it better for people who are there and save taxpayers money at the same time? How many of you think that's possible? Okay, you all just proved that you're smarter than the whole U.S. Congress. What's wrong with Medicaid? Well, first place, it doesn't improve health. And how do we know that? Because we had a randomized controlled trial out in Oregon, the gold standard for these things. They selected people by lottery. Half of them went into Medicaid, half of them stayed uninsured. 2 years down the road, they compared the two groups. There was no difference in their physical health. And one way to think about that is to realize that people who are uninsured get about 80% of the health care of people who are on Medicaid. And if they get a bill they can't afford, they just don't pay it. And that's why Medicaid doesn't appear to make much difference to people's health. Now, something else about Medicaid that may surprise you, you might think that when people get on Medicaid, they don't have to go to the emergency room for free care. They can go other places. It turns out, when people enroll in Medicaid, their trips to the emergency room increase by 40%. They make more trips to the emergency room. So here in Dallas, our safety net hospital is Parkland. And Parkland will tell you online that the average in and out time in their emergency room is almost 6 hours. They don't try to disguise it. They tell you before you ever get there, if you want to look it up, how long you're going to have to wait. Of course, you're sitting there around other sick people, and most people who go there are hourly, so that means they lose a day's pay, in addition to risking whatever risks there are and sitting around other sick people. Something else interesting about Medicaid is that people who have it don't value it very much. So as part of the Oregon experiment, they actually had ways of estimating what value people place on their enrollment in Medicaid. And it turns out that it was as low as 20 cents on the dollar. So what that means is if you approach someone on Medicaid and you ask them, well, what would you sell your Medicaid insurance for? Or what would to buy it from you? It turns out that some of them would sell it for as little as 20 cents. I think the average was between 20 cents and 50 cents. So people who have it don't place a good bit of value on it. And by the way, if you don't have Medicaid, you think you might at some point need it. If you go to the emergency room, you have a problem, and for some reason you want to join Medicaid, there's a look back. You can look back under the old rules 90 days to cover your medical expenses while you join. So we voted to last year, and the two parties are arguing about how much they're going to spend. No one wants reform, but I had some ideas for reform, and I'm going to tell you about 3 of them. And Newt Gingrich liked it, Karl Rove liked it, Steve Forbes, Senator Cruz. And idea number one is let folks on Medicaid buy health care the way they buy food. Now, the other day I was at the Tom Thumb supermarket. This woman ahead of me had one of these EBT cards, which is her food stamp card. And she hands it to the cashier, and the cashier said, well, not enough money on this card. So the woman opened her billfold and pulled out a private credit card. I was surprised at how many cards she had, by the way. But she pulls out her private card and pays the balance. We don't allow that to happen in healthcare. So if this woman, let's say, had an ear infection, she goes to a minute clinic, and let's say Medicaid pays $35 for the minute clinic, may charge $70. I'm just making up some numbers here. So let's say she hands her Medicaid card to the nurse and says, here's $35 in cash to bring me up to $70. Well, if the nurse accepts the cash, she can go to prison. So not only do we not allow sensible transactions in healthcare, we actually criminalize them. So my proposal is let them buy healthcare the way they buy food. Let them go to any doctor in the city of Dallas. And if the Medicaid rate isn't high enough, if they want to see their doctor, they can pay out of pocket for the difference. That's the way they buy groceries. If we could buy healthcare that way, they would have access to a lot more providers. I'm going to guess that a third of the doctors in Dallas don't take any new Medicaid patients. I'm going to guess that those who say they take Medicaid, a fourth of them, you can't get an appointment with them. And so access to physician care is really hard if you're on Medicaid. It would be easier than what I just said. The second idea is these folks have a savings account. Funded by Medicaid. So what they can do is put money into an account if the individual agreed to be responsible for all primary care, let's say. And at the end of the year, if there's still money left in the account, they can have it with no taxes, no penalties. So and they can pay market prices with the money from the account. So they could go see any doctor, they could go to a medic clinic, they could go to the urgent care clinic, they could go to the emergency room. But what they would learn is that the emergency room costs more than the medic clinic, costs more than the urgent care clinic. And if people were managing their own money, they would know that you can waste a lot of money on healthcare and not get better results. But you can also manage your money wisely, limit your expenses, avoid the emergency room, and a 6-hour wait, and they get better care for lower costs, and the money they save is theirs to keep. Now, the third reform, which I recommended, was the primary care, direct primary care doctors. We used to call this concierge care, and for some patients, there still is concierge care. They pay thousands of dollars to a doctor to be able to talk to them on the phone and get other services outside of Medicare, outside of normal insurance. But there's a model out of Wichita, which is spread around the country. It's concierge care for very reasonable prices. And you can go online right now to Atlas MD in Wichita, and they'll tell you that for a mother, we charge $50 a month, for a child, $10 a month, for everything a primary care doctor does. And very, very reasonable amount. If we allow the Medicaid folks to have a sum of money in a health savings account, and to have that kind of relationship with the doctor, that's 24/7 care, by the way. So you wake up in the middle of the night, your child has a stomach ache, and you don't know whether you should go to the emergency room or not. You can get on the phone or do a Zoom call and get professional advice before you go to that emergency room. So these three reforms are reforms that I recommended. Again, we had, Carl Rowe, Newt Gingrich, a lot of people liked them. What was the problem? Well, the hospitals were the problem. Because they went into the Republican committee room and said, we hate everything John Gibb was talking about. We like our emergency room. We make money on our emergency room. And that's why we didn't get those reforms. Again, neither party had any interest in reform for the first half of last year. As bad as Medicaid is, I gave you 3 ways to reform it, make it better, but I'm sure there are more.
no interest in either party. So then we go into the second half of the year, and now what are we talking about? We're talking about Obamacare subsidies, that second tier of subsidies. And I wonder if you know why they exist. What happened was, they're called COVID subsidies, by the way. So we start out with Obamacare subsidizing people up to 400% of the poverty level. What is 400% of poverty? It's for an individual, $60,000 plus some change. For a couple, it's about $80,000 plus some change. Subsidies up to that point. If you get above that point, you don't get any subsidy at all. So again, we came in with a second tier level of subsidies. The excuse was COVID, but the reality was different. The reality was that everybody who wasn't in the subsidized part of this market was leaving. So it was within a death spiral. And it's not hard to understand why. If you weren't getting a subsidy, if you don't get a subsidy today, if you take the average premium across the country for Obamacare, what I mean by Obamacare is what's sold in the individual market to people who buy their home insurance. Take the average premium added to the average deductible, it comes to $25,000. So that means get any benefit out of your health insurance plan. Not hard to understand why people were leaving. You know, for that much money, I think you can buy a lower price Tesla. And remember, this is every year.